This is Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm Adron Buske. This episode of Fictitious features the speaker panel Here There Be Dragons, Creating Fresh Stories in Fantasy, which was recorded live at San Diego Comic-Con 2018. The first three guests of Fictitious Season 2 all appeared on this panel, so it seems like a good time to share this lively and insightful discussion of fantasy storytelling. I moderated the panel, which included Rebecca Kuang, author of The Poppy War, Robert Jackson Bennett, author of Foundryside, and Jason Denzel, author of Mystic Dragon, all of whom you've heard interviewed in depth on this show before. The panel also included Tomi Adeyemi, author of this year's huge breakout young adult novel, Children of Blood and Bone, and veteran YA author Mary E. Pearson, author of Dance of Thieves. The panel took place in front of a packed, enthusiastic Thursday evening audience at Comic-Con as we talked about blazing new trails on the well-trodden map of fantasy. It's a fun, passionate conversation with an amazing collection of talent, so I hope you enjoy Here There Be Dragons.
We'd like to see a nice, full, excited, attractive fantasy fan crowd. There we go! Woo! Yeah. That's what we were looking for in here. Thank you. It is 7:30, so we're going to get this thing started. Welcome to Here There Be Dragons. I like these guys. This is good. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the craft of writing fantasy and all of its different sub-niches and oddities and weirdness and fantastical worlds that are created within it. And we're going to be talking about what makes fantasy, how we can apply fresh voices to it, take it in new directions, move away from some of the codified tropes that you see all the time in it, and tell some new stories. And in order to do that, I've got some great authors here tonight. My name is Adron Buske. I am the host of the Fictitious podcast, which is all about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. And I'm super excited to share this evening with you. And thank you so much for coming out late in an evening here at Comic-Con. So the first thing I'm going to do is, well, before I actually introduce everybody, you'll see that we got the thing rolling off the side here. You're going to see all of the authors, their names, their Twitter accounts. So that's up there. So if they say something really smart and prophetic and amazing, tweet that thing out. And if they say something really dumb, do the same thing. Because that makes all this a lot more fun. And then you can see their present works. And I've read all of them, and they're all fantastic. So afterwards, immediately go buy those things. Yeah, so we're going to start down here with Rebecca and just let each of you introduce yourselves and tell us about your book.
Hi, everybody. My name's Rebecca Kuang. I write as R.F. Kuang. My debut novel, The Poppy War, is basically Avatar: The Last Airbender if Azula was the main character and everybody was on drugs.
I'm kidding. Man, that is a killer tagline. Well done.
Look, Azula turned me gay.
There you go. I'm Robert Jackson Bennett. My book is Foundryside. They had a galley. So, I asked for a galley to show off the cover. They said it's a really big room, be a really big crowd. And then I saw this lying around. This is what my book looks like. It's extremely large. And I really want to thank the crowd for being here because I've been outside. I'm from Texas. It's 106 where I am right now, where I was right now. And when I got off the plane, I'm not going to say that I had an orgasm, but I'm going to imply it and then drink some water.
His Twitter account's right up there. Make sure that you quote tweet that one immediately.
It feels synthetic. Photo. There's some big machine in the sky making your weird artificial weather, and I love it.
Hi, my name is Tomi Adeyemi, and I'm the author of Children of Blood and Bone. And thank you. I have two pitches for it because we connected because of this. Because one way, when I started out, I pitched it as African: The Last Airbender, and now I do Black Panther with magic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Denzel. I'm the author of the Mystic Trilogy. I am also the webmaster of DragonMount.com. Any Robert Jordan fans out there? Thought so. Yeah, so I'm here promoting my second book that just came out this week, and I'm looking forward to it. I don't have an Avatar pitch, but I am wearing a Korra t-shirt, so, it's like the trend here.
Yes, memo on this.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Pearson, and I have written, my 11th book is coming out in a few weeks, Dance of Thieves, and it's a spin-off of The Remnant Chronicles, which is, I don't know if it's a spoiler to say it, but it's a post-apocalyptic medieval story. And that will be out August 7th, so Dance of Thieves.
So before we really get into the bones of fantasy and what makes these stories, the first thing that I want to explore is what the entry point was for each of you into fantasy, and kind of what flavor of fantasy it was that really kind of broke things open for you. And basically what I'll do is I'll start back down with Mary, and we'll come back down, and then from that point on, we'll go free for all.
I would have to say probably, for me, fairy tales, obviously. That was my very first introduction. And I was always fascinated with any kind of fantasy, but I especially was taken with a lot of science fiction, which is also a type of fantasy. Fahrenheit 451 when I was in high school, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. Later on, Sonia Hartnett, who does a lot of magical realism. She's an Australian author. So I really have kind of a wide breadth of fantasy that interests me.
I'm really excited about being on this panel, and I came from a fantasy. My first fantasies that I enjoyed were the traditional ones, the C.S. Lewis and Lloyd Alexander. That led me into things like Dragonlance and anything by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, and that was a very traditional fantasy introduction. But from there, branched off. So I'm looking forward to talking about this.
I think me, like a lot of people, my first introduction to magic was Harry Potter. But then my full nerd came out like when I discovered Avatar: The Last Airbender and like Naruto and Bleach and Death Note, like, because a lot of times people are like, what were your childhood stories? And I was like, no, it was really anime, which is why I think my stories now are like so bloody. And there's so, I remember the first draft or the early drafts of my book, I had that like sound that you have in anime when someone like holds the sword really cool. And my agent was like, what is this? And I was like, I'll take those out. You're right. It doesn't work. But
So mine was actually, I think it was probably Mary Poppins, the books. I don't know if y'all have read those. I got them when I was 9 or 10, and they were like books that my family passed down. They were from like the 1940s, and they were like yellowed and crumbling. And the book Mary Poppins is different from the movie, in that she's unfriendly and terrifying and almost sort of like a god. Because they go to all these like weird little side worlds where like the constellations come down and dance for her. And the one thing that all the constellations do is make sure to make Mary Poppins happy. And you slowly are like, who is this lady? And what I really liked was that it suggested so much happening beyond what you saw on the page, which I think is a really great tool to use in fantasy, is a sense of deep mystery, that there's a whole world happening out there and you're only seeing a hint of it.
Is Mary Poppins a Time Lord?
Sure, she could be.
So when my family immigrated to the U.S. in 2000, my dad went out and bought a bunch of DVDs from a list that was like movies you must watch to understand Americans. And one of them was Mr. Bean, and the other was Lord of the Rings, like the entire trilogy. But like, try to imagine watching Lord of the Rings if you don't understand English, and it's just like people like dancing and like fighting about things. So we were really scared of the orcs, and my mom thought that it wouldn't be good for us to see orcs as children. So one of my most vivid childhood memories is her holding up a sheet in front of the television and being like, "You can't look, I'll let you know when the orcs are gone and it's safe." So it was a very confusing introduction to the white Western literary canon.
With that being your guys' start, is there a specific work by an author or like a specific book that you feel like broke the rules of fantasy for you a little bit? Like something where you, like, it really rang your bell and you were like, oh wow, beyond just that I enjoy this, that this is a genre of limitless potential and I can tell amazing stories in here. And there's some similarities to the stuff that got you started, but is there something else specific that just changed the game for you? And just anybody jump in.
Probably Sandman. You could do anything in Sandman, and like the way that it was a story about stories, I think was really interesting, and how like it was never satisfying in the way that you thought it was going to be satisfying. It didn't function like most stories, and that like it always felt kind of like winsome and bittersweet how things ended, and that it hurt in a very good way is the way that I would put it.
A good hurt.
A good hurt.
Yeah.
Has anyone read An Ember in the Ashes by Subba Tahir? Yeah, it's for me that it was like, it wasn't just like, it was a distinct moment. Like, I remember staying up all night and reading it and being really dehydrated. And like, when it ended, I was like, I have to write. And I never felt like such a pull. But I really don't think I'd be sitting here if it wasn't for that book, because it just completely, I always describe it as I felt like I was getting Harry Potter book 7, but in book 1. And just knowing that you could go straight for that epic battle and that you could care about characters so deeply that you could really give someone 500 pages and they'd be like, let's go for more. It completely like changed the way I thought about fantasy.
For me, I think, again, I'll go back to Sonia Hartnett. Does anybody know who she is? Oh my gosh, she's such a fantastic writer. Thursday's Child. And it starts out as like a family. It seems like it's just a family story. And then it kind of reels you in, and her little brother goes missing. And then we find out he likes to dig holes. And then pretty soon he's underground and he's growing nails and he's becoming an animal. It's almost like Metamorphosis, Kafka's Metamorphosis. And it just becomes this whole metaphorical story about her brother transforming into this animal underground, and everyone just kind of goes with it. And that was, a real game changer for me.
It was Ken Liu's Grace of Kings for me, because I had never read a book where all the characters, a book in English, like a widespread book in the U.S., where all the characters were Chinese and none of them were tropes. Like, none of the women were running around with like chi paos like slid up to their hips and like doing dainty splits where their chi paos right up and their eyes are almond. And it was also the first book that made me realize that a Chinese-American author writing solely about Chinese heritage and about our stories could find a mainstream audience in the West. So that was like the kick out the door for me to be like, there is a place for you in this market, and there are people who will read your stories. So Ken Liu has been like super inspirational to me.
More recently for me, I certainly have had those stories over the years when I was younger that were game changers, but I want to draw attention to a series of books that probably a lot of you know, because it's been winning a lot of awards, is N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth Saga. And the first one, help me out, what was the first one? The 5th season. Thank you. Yeah, and that book was a punch in the gut for me to read. I listened to it first on Audible and went back and then reread it on paper, and it's just... it was something that challenged a lot of my perceptions in a very positive way, and it's something that continues to help me elevate my game, both as just being aware of what's going on in society and as a writer myself. So that's something that right now is very actively leveling me up.
So we know with fantasy and with any genre, when genre is defined by a new kind of story, sometimes it codifies elements in place, things that we think of as cliches or tropes or just standard mechanisms of the genre. And fantasy has a lot of those. And, and some of them you can see very prevalently displayed over and over again. What do you think are some of the best aspects of fantasy, the things we would recognize as the primary structures of fantasy? And what are some of the underappreciated elements, things that you wish you were seeing more of in your fantasy today?
I think the best, or always the most fun part of fantasy is magic. I think we all just love magic and want to be able to do magic. And I was arguing with my boyfriend before this because I was like, I want to keep my hair like this. He's like, you look like a witch. I'm like, exactly. And I was like, this is the closest I'll come. And so I think that's the kind of the most common thing. But I think now as a storyteller, I really appreciate stories that don't have magic but still have that fantastical world building. Like, I was really late to Into the Badlands. I just discovered it like last month, but I was like, oh, it's a fantasy without magic. I was like, it's like American Kung Fu. It's incredible. And it's the costumes and it's the the barons and the world, like just the level. I think I don't know who said it. I have a bad memory. Someone said it. I think it was you, about knowing there's a whole world out there and you're only seeing a little piece of it. I think that's the most kind of underappreciated element of really, really good fantasies, because those are the ones where you return to and you want to watch it again and again, and you want to write fan fiction and you just want to imagine where you'd be in that world, even though they're usually really brutal worlds. So you're like, I wouldn't last 5 minutes, but at least I would look cool. So.
Yeah. I will look dope for the 5 minutes I live in this space. Yeah.
So the thing that I think that I like the most is that in fantasy, you can change the world and change the rules of reality to look at a single like issue or concept or problem. Like if you want to figure out what you feel about death, you can make death a character or have rules about death that can isolate your feelings about that, and you can sort of test yourself. Like Pratchett is one of the ones who does this really well, or did this really well, where he would take a conceit and make it literal and put rules around it and see how society would change itself like around this conceit. And it would reveal not only how we feel about this thing, like about this idea, but about how we work in our own right. And I think that that's really something that's kind of underused. I think that you don't have to be totally blunt about it and make death a person, but there are ways that you can rig the rules in fantasy to approach a concept in a way that's unusual and enlightening for the audience, if that makes any sense.
That was like profound and stuff.
You're welcome.
Mine's going to be less profound. I like the super deep friendships that are formed between like members on the quest when they're like, "You're so loyal to me, I would die for you." And I like how in the past it was just like subtextually gay, and now it's just explicitly gay.
Are you getting like the Sam and Frodo vibes there?
Oh yeah.
He said, "Oh yeah."
You changed the soundtrack to Lord of the Rings to a bounce.
Was that the first thing you picked up on when you watched it when you were young and watching it?
I was like, "They love each other, Mom," and she's like, "No."
I think that for me, one of the things that I love most about fantasy, in that it does better than other genres, is that it's so unapologetically and gloriously uplifts the idea of heroism and that sense of bravery, courage in the face of extreme adversity, and it can turn into a trope, but at the same time, it's something that it's one of the reasons, along with all the other reasons that other people mentioned, magic and the settings and everything, that I think that's why we come back to it. Even going back to the ancient Greek myths, it was the gods were the troublemakers, but it's the heroes that people uplifted so much more and celebrated in a lot of ways. In so many of the Iliad, the Odyssey, it's the human heroes who are the heroes, and the gods who are even though they're more powerful, they're the ones who are secondary to them in many ways.
Sports fans have athletes, and we have barbarians.
We have like Naruto.
Yeah, we have some version of that.
Yeah, we have like our plastic kunais, and we're like, ugh.
What are some of the oversaturated tropes of this genre? Things that we see too much, things that are relied on too heavily, and that maybe drag the genre down because people are just hitting them too often.
The white male protagonist.
I think we're all reluctant to say because somebody here may have written one of those tropes, but really, to me, there's no trope that if it's written in a fresh way, I can go to a wizard school 1,000 times if it's written in some way that captures my heart. Or I can go to, there's the Hunger Games competitions, or, it just depends on how it's written. Because honestly, really, there's nothing new under the sun. I don't think anybody can write anything new. It's the way that it's written and how that character relates to the reader.
So there's that phrase that like if it's well done, then it's a trope, and if it's poorly done, then it's a
cliche.
Yeah, I do feel like there are certain tropes that get used so much that at some point in time it becomes a lot easier for them to be a cliche. Like the threshold gets lowered. One of the things, have you guys ever heard of the term kick the dog moment? Where you're like,
yes.
Like, let's show that this guy's bad. How bad is he? Well, he just kicked a dog. And you're like, shit, he's bad.
And conversely, if you want to show him as good, you have him pet the dog.
Yeah.
Right,
like, one of the things
of the audience under 18 years of age.
Okay.
But it's like nighttime. Actually, I just saw a kid.
Nighttime.
Never mind.
It's dark now. Like, one of the things that kind of gets, oh yeah, I did say the S word. I see why you were saying that now. I was like, so does she know where I'm going to go with this? One of the things that I think is getting a little bit old now is, and I think it's a hangover from the 90s, where comics and things that were pop art had to prove that they were serious, and like one way to prove to the audience that it's serious is like, let's put sexual assault in here in a really big way. And you're like, yeah, we're grim and gritty. So you know not that like all the rules are off. And like for a while there was like a thing that seemed really prevalent. And then at some point everyone was like, why is this in here? And so increasingly these days, I feel myself a little bit turned off when I feel like that's introduced in a way where the sole purpose is to message to me that like, this is going to get messed up and I'm grim. And I'm like, I don't really like this being used as a tool that just messages this one thing to me. That's getting old for me personally.
I feel it took me a while. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I didn't think people were going to.
It took me a while. I was like, I have to think about this because when you said it, I was kind of agreed with Mary where there's nothing really new. It's only if it's told badly that it feels like I've seen this 1,000 times. So I was like, what's the one thing that I always can't stand? And I think I see it a little bit more in adaptations or films than in textual fantasy. But when it's just like this entire race of like elves and wizards, and then they have like the one black one and like the one Chinese one because they read some article about diversity and they're like, okay, I'm going to do it. But I'm like, if there's just one, then just keep us out. Just keep us out. You're not doing it. Or like I saw it in, I think it was like Thor Ragnarok. You know, they're running around and I saw like 2 of us. And I'm like, that just doesn't make sense. So just don't do it. Just don't do it if you're not really going to do it.
People of color don't exist in a vacuum.
I'm just like, it can't be that hard to find a balance of extras. I was like, that's someone's job. So that's the one thing I can't. I was like, don't do it. I'm like, this hurts worse. I'd rather think you didn't try at all than to see this was the extent of your effort. So.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I think that is, for me, that is the heart of where we can really grow as a genre. Representation matters, absolutely. And I, being a white guy here, and I grew up in the United States in a middle-class family, I'm cisgender and everything like that, I grew up with every hero that looked like me. I mean, like I grew up, looking like Luke Skywalker, and I had Randall Thor from the Wheel of Time books, and I had everyone from, the Dragonlance books and the Greek myths. I mean, everyone. Like I grew up a lot of heroes, and now, as an adult, I have come to see that a lot of other people don't look like me, and they need heroes too. And so we have there's almost a default when you're reading a book and you come across a male character, and so many times, and in publishing we do it, and in TV we do it, where the default is that the hero is going to be a white guy. He's going to be a straight white guy or something. And I think that we need to change that default, or at least equalize it, so that when we go, so I think it's wonderful that, in the last Airbender, the main character is, definitely not white,
except for in the movie adaptation.
Let's not get started on that, So, yeah. I mean, there are other people on this panel who can probably speak more eloquently about it than I can, but I think that for myself, I try to be as aware of it as I can, and I hope that, if any of you guys are writers and everything, that, I hope you are too, because, we need heroes representation for, people other that just look like me.
And to expand on that, not just the characters being people of color or various sexual identities, but having the authors be those people too, because I remember when I was in high school, and I really, really wanted to be a writer, but all the authors I knew were dead white men. And I thought, I have no chance of ever being one of those. And then I came across an author who was alive, and she was a female. And I remember crying, just sobbing, because I thought, maybe I can be an author. And I think our children, I write young adult fiction, and besides seeing the characters within the pages, I think they need to see those role models, so that all of those young children who maybe are in some marginalized part of society, that they can see that they can be an author too, because there are so many, young writers out there who need to see, besides seeing themselves in the pages of the book, they need to see those authors too.
So one thing that I will say is that when I wrote City of Stairs, There was a point in time where the protagonist meets a character, and I had thought it was going to be a man, and I started to write the scene, and I realized I didn't like it. It felt really kind of boring. So I changed that character being a 48-year-old woman. And suddenly it felt like there were like no rules. I could do anything because like I hadn't seen this character, so I could do a lot of stuff. And I realized that when it comes to like male protagonists or white male protagonists, there's a lot of people doing that. And it's kind of a crowded party. And I don't know if you guys have ever been to like an open bar where it's just you and the hors d'oeuvres and all the wine. It feels awesome. You get to do anything. And that's kind of what it felt like when I started writing that character where I was like, I actually don't think I've seen a lot of this. What can I do with this? I can do literally anything with this. As opposed to like a white male protagonist, you're aware that there's like a jillion of those, and there's some expectations and rules and what's been done. You want to make sure to make yourself a little bit different. So from a purely selfish perspective, it was a lot of fun to do that. And it's tough to go back now.
I do think the caveat, though, has to be that when you are writing from another perspective, you have to make sure that you're...
You can't be a moron.
Because there are some people that are like, he's going to be black.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, but that means something, and that you have to actually carry that fully, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, you actually have to think it through and do it right. You can't be stupid about it.
Yeah.
Hopefully I was.
That's definitely something that I want to explore here is talking about the fact that like as you are trying to populate these worlds with people who don't look like you, that don't come from the same background as you, and expanding that vocabulary in the fantasy medium, what do you do in order to do that well? Are you employing like sensitivity readers? Are you what base of people do you surround yourself with to call you out on something if you maybe have taken a wrong step with it? And how do you course correct for that?
I think one thing is recognizing that if you're going to change the racial dynamics of a story, that doesn't mean it's like a coloring page and you just like picked a different color marker. It means that it changes every facet of how the world works, right? Like the lens, the way characters move through the world, the way they interact with each other, the way they interact with power especially. So one of the best lessons I ever learned from N.K. Jemisin, who I think is just a hero to us all, is that one of the oldest tropes in fantasy is this desire to return to the status quo. Yes. Like the Dark Lord attacks and the white male cis farm boy is like, I will defeat you so we can go back to society as normal and everything will be okay. But the only people who want society to go back to normal are the white people in power. So the genius there are many genius things about the Broken Earth trilogy, but the best part to me is that it asks the question, what if the world is not worth saving? What if it's built on systems of oppression and injustice that we don't want to go back to? And what does that mean for the future if we break the status quo? What do different alternatives look like? And it means asking those large questions for the futures that marginalized peoples want to see, instead of just being like everybody just wants to defeat the bad guy and go back to living as normal.
Yeah. So that's a trope that I'm pretty sick of too. That's kind of built into us, which is this idea of like a culture in stasis, where things have been the same for like 15 to 30,000 years. There's been beards and swords and magic for X amount of time. Whereas if you look at our own history, like the past 1,000 years has been an incredible amount of change. So when I wrote Stairs and when I wrote Foundryside, I really wanted to look at a society where things were changing a huge amount, and some changes were good, and some changes were bad, and you weren't sure about how to make things better for people, about how changes lead to conflict and like exacerbate conflict, and don't always go in the way that you want them to go. I think that that's critical because things are changing a huge amount these days. Things have always been changing, but things are only changing faster and faster. So I feel like kind of glorifying this idea of a culture in stasis is not helpful for us trying to navigate the era that we live in, and is sort of an escape. This idea of like, it's just going to be me and my hoe and my potato farm, and occasionally I pull out my sword and fend off some orcs. And I'm like, back at, like when we farmed exclusively, an incredible amount of people starved and died like all the time, and you were pooping in a tree out back, and there were like worms and things that were like crawling in through your feet at night. And like, oh yeah, that actually was incredibly bad. And like, it's way better to change, and change brings out problems, and we have to figure that out. I think that's something that's much more worth examining to me personally.
I do think in the young adult space we have a lot of conversations about like diversity and writing diversity, and One thing is sensitivity readers, which for people who aren't familiar with them, what they do is there's someone from a marginalized background that you're writing about, and they'll read your story, and they'll tell you, like, hey, here are the issues I saw, or here are things to note, or here's actually, I guess the best example is, like, for Moana, Disney had this Oceanic Trust, and, like, the example they used is that they were like, oh, Moana wouldn't throw a coconut because our people would never, like, disrespect nature that way. So that's kind of what a sensitivity reader does. And a lot of the times whenever there's a conversation about that, someone is like, that's censorship, that's censorship. And it's like, first of all, that's not censorship. This is not a government organ. That's not, use a dictionary. But a lot of times people are like, no, you're trying to police me and police what I can write, and that's not what writing is. And it always, like, this is so specific, so it's probably not worth saying, but in Drunken Love, when Beyonce does that laugh, that's like, that's kind of how I feel, because, like, my book it's all people who look like me. I am a Nigerian American, like, I'm first generation. I'm writing about Nigerians. I'm writing about the Black experience. I'm writing about the problems Black people face today. I've also been Black my whole life, so I have a lot of primary research. I needed sensitivity readers. I needed lots of sensitivity readers, and it's because it was important to get it right. And so it's like I was revising my own book again and again and again to make sure everything I was doing was right, that it wouldn't be disrespectful to this type of person, or that it wouldn't sort of, I guess, devalue another type of Black experience. And so it's like, knowing how hard I went and how hard my sensitivity readers went on trying to make sure that my book worked out, it's always crazy to me when someone who doesn't have decades of primary research on the experience they're writing about is just like, oh, I don't really want to change that, or you guys, I tried. And that's always the voice it sounds in, because it's always people complaining. I was like, no one asked you to do this. And if you're not willing to do the work, it's sort of the same thing. It's like, don't put one Black person in all of the elves. Don't make one Black elf. It's worse. I know you don't think it's worse, but it's worse. So
there's this trash can argument that see a lot now where people are like, well, I was told I had to have diversity, so I introduced a person, and then I did it wrong. And they're like, but I tried, so you cannot fault me in any way. I'm like, no, it's not the way it works. You've got to actually put the effort in.
There's a great resource out there for writers, and it's a workshop that I took a couple weekends ago called Writing the Other, and it's specifically touches on all this stuff. And as we've established, as a white cisgendered male, I do want to write more diverse characters, but at the same time, there is no way that I could ever write the book that you are trying to write, because I am not a Nigerian American. I do not have the Black experience. That's not something I'm familiar with. And so if I want to go outside of writing just, white male heroes, and I really would like to do it, and my books feature the main characters is a young woman of color, and I researched the heck out of that. And yes, I had sensitivity readers, and I approached it from as many angles as I could, and I still didn't fully get it right. And in the second book, I got a little bit better, and I'm probably going to try and get better for the last one. And so, but this is something that all of us have as writers. I think there's a responsibility to know, like, what stories are yours to tell and what stories maybe for now where you're at to back off of. Like, it probably would not be appropriate for me to be writing a story about a young Mexican girl coming over the Mexican border, in San Diego and from Mexico and, getting locked up or whatever. That's not something that's not my story to tell right now, or maybe ever. And there are plenty of things for me to tell, but personally, I'm going to let someone else do that.
So in the audience right now, how many of you are people who like to write and fancy the idea of writing their own stories? Yeah, quite a lot of you.
That's so nice.
Yeah. In author circles, there's a phrase that goes around a lot that's writing to market, particularly in the indie publishing realm, but I think in general. And basically what writing to market means is that if you've got a genre, sub-niche that you like, that you are basically constructing it around the things that your audience expects so that they can get more of what they want. So they're like, oh, if they really liked Harry Potter, here's another thing that's kind of like Harry Potter. Because there is an audience that just wants to kind of read more of the same. And it sometimes comes with the awareness of tropes. They're like, okay, if I'm writing military space fantasy, it has to have this grizzled old white dude, like, flying the aging ship that's falling apart, but they'll save the universe with a ragtag crew. Name 90 different books and movies you've seen that follow that outline, and a lot of them are still great. Is that something that when you guys are writing your stories that you're thinking about, when you're talking to your publishers and editors, like that they're saying, okay, this is what the market expects, this is what the market wants. Do you say F that and just go your own way? Like, how did that work?
I just don't, and you guys can tell me if it's different in adult, but I feel like it can't be. It's such a competitive market. This actually came up earlier today in a panel and Victoria Schwab said that like the book where she said her first 3 books she was kind of writing to get published, and her 4th book she wrote the most specific thing for her. She wasn't even planning on trying to publish it, but because she's like, this is only something I would want to read, and that was the book that really started it for her. And even for me, like when I describe like Children of Blood and Bone, I'm like, this is kind of just like if it's a diary entry with lots of fan fiction and giant lions. I was like, this is really just what I want to read. But I find usually when people write those stories, like those are the ones that shine. I don't know if there are some times where people will come together and create a story, but I don't know if you can. I don't know people who successfully.
Yeah, I don't know if that's in the young adult market or what, but you absolutely cannot write to trends because, well, there's several reasons, but one, by the time you're done writing it and it gets edited and published, that trend is over. So nothing is going to happen there. And then the other thing is it takes a long time to write a book. So you absolutely have to have passion and be totally in love with what you're writing. And if you're trying to write to some imaginary trend that you think is going to be hot, I think you're just going to become bored with your book. So you have to have passion for it. And never and I've been doing this for a long time, never once has my editor ever said, could you write this, ever? I think sometimes, especially if you do a spin-off or something, people think, they wanted you to milk that cash cow. Absolutely not.
Is it different in adult?
Well, I will say that I know some people who have said literally that they write to market, and they're very successful. But the thing that I think is critical is, like, what's a market? Because in most businesses, like, market means that there's, like, a specific need that you can, like identify for something. Like, I need a toothbrush. But, like, when it comes to books, like, you don't necessarily need to have a fantasy book. You just would prefer to have it. It'd be nice to have a nice fantasy book. So really, when it comes to, like, when most people use writing for market, what they're really talking about is copying something that's been successful, which I'm not sure is the right way to go about doing it, because the stuff that is successful and remembered is the stuff that's different from everything else, that satisfies a need that no one knew that they had. It's like what Ford said about cars. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have told me faster horses. So I think that most writing, and indeed most publishing, is kind of feeling your way forward blindly in a room full of obstacles. And you don't know what's going to take off and what won't. And so the best thing to do is to write the story you think needs to be told and that you'd like to read, and write it the best way possible.
Yeah, I have 2 thoughts on this. The first is that the predictive idea that the market, what we should create is more of what the market has been reading, just leads to really bland, bad stories, and I think reproduces whiteness. Like, that is exactly the reason why we get terrible, like, reboots of the same Spider-Man storyline, like, year after year, instead of, like, a Shuri movie. I don't think the market knows what it wants, and I don't think people are good at predicting what the market wants, and I think the only things that, like, really smash and do well are things that are new and innovative, which we haven't seen before. And the second thing is, if you think about market, like, the average reader in the United States does not look like me, and it does not look like Tomi. It looks like our fellow panelists. But I'm not going to write for those people. I'm going to write for, like, the 15-year-old version of myself who was looking for books about her on library shelves and couldn't find them. I mean, people write for different reasons. If you, like, want to write for the majority audience, like, that's fine, like, no judgment. But also, like, there are other people looking for stories about them, and that's who I'm going to write for.
But I also think the funny thing, too, is, because I don't think the average reader looks like this, but what publishers thought and what movie people thought is that the average consumer looks like this. Yeah. And it happens with every market. It's, because, like, the best example, or not the best example. Like I could easily just go like Black Panther made $1 billion, but also you see it in other things. Like when Rihanna dropped Fenty and made like $75 million in the first month because she had all of these shades that had never been created before for girls with melanin. All of these other makeup companies started being like, hey, I think there's brown people and I think they buy makeup too. Yeah. Therefore, we will make more money if we make more shades. And the belief before was just like, they're not buying this, so just have one brown shade. But then she released 40 shades. And suddenly it changed all of the advertisements I was seeing. And I didn't even pay attention to makeup before that. But like I saw all of these expansions and it continues. And it's sort of, we see this a lot with YA. It's like I think I was able to publish a story like Children of Blood and Bone because of a story like An Ember in the Ashes, which was this Middle Eastern fantasy, or because of a story like The Hate U Give, which was a young adult story about police brutality. It's like, once like 10 sort of different things prove that they are palatable to a wider audience, then more people start jumping in. But I think it's sort of changing the idea that just because you write that story for the 15-year-old version of yourself, that like, he's not gonna like it too. And I think that's kind of what keeps happening.
And it's really important for a young white boy to read those stories that reflect those characters or other things so that their world can change with that formative work, and they will look for more of it as they go along too. The exposure, like, it's like you may tell that story for yourself back then, but it's really important that all those other people get it too. That's what makes some really powerful storytelling that will last the length of time. We have about 9-10 minutes left. There's a microphone right there in the middle of the room. If you have questions, please line up, and we can have some questions for our panelists. As I ask you to do this, let's keep in mind that you are there to ask questions and they're there to tell stories, not the other way around. And because we only have a few minutes, let's try to keep it as brief as possible. And whoever's up there first, take a shot.
Hi there. So I'm really interested in the relationship between the setting of your books and the characters and the stories that you tell. The setting and world building is really an important part of fantasy traditionally. So I'm just kind of curious, did you create the world first, and then did that influence and change the characters and stories you wanted to write? Or did you create the stories and characters you wanted to write, and that informed the world? Or did you just create the characters and then dressed it up in a fictional world, and there wasn't a strong relationship between the two?
So kind of like a chicken or the egg of fantasy. So which came first?
So for me, when I start my story, I think about what subject I'm going to look at. Is this about history? Is it about change? Is it about, like, what am I trying to, like, examine with this? And then I build the rules of my world so that each facet will touch upon this in some way. And then when I have some general idea about which characters I want to feature in it, but I really want to make sure that I capture the perspectives of everyone so that we get full coverage of this issue. So like with Foundryside, it's about how change and about how the way that we advance makes commodities out of ourselves. So like we do it to others, and we also have it done to ourselves. So it's where magic is sort of like an industrialized process. And so I have the slave who like escaped the system that it created. I have the cop who's looking for her because she's a thief now. I also have the guy who actually makes all the machines, and the girl who works for him as well. So I wanted to make sure that I had someone that could look at this from all angles, and also a world that touched upon this in as many ways as possible, if that makes any sense.
I think the important thing to remember, though, is it doesn't matter. Like, every writer is different, every book is different, so it's like whatever is your entry point into a story, whether it's a piece of dialogue or a character, or like what if there were unicorns, but instead of wings they had fire, like whatever it is, like just go there and remember that revision is real, because it never comes together all at once. It's, you'll have a character which will change the world, and then you'll have a plot thing which will change the character and the rules of the system. So it's just like, just pull out as much as you can, because once it's on the page, then you can make it all fit together.
Yeah, that made it sound like I had it all planned out, and I don't. It takes me a while to figure out what the hell I'm talking about, and then I have to basically try and distill it down.
Okay, great, thanks. Next.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for coming out here. It's really great. As writers, balancing inspiration and creativity with work ethic, that sort of thing. I was just wondering how you guys balance that, the inspiration and work.
Well, for me, one thing is a contract with a deadline.
Yeah, I was about to say.
I have to show up, but Even beyond that, even if I didn't have a contract, for me, very often you don't feel inspired. And so I have little tricks that I play on myself, and they pretty much work because I'm gullible. And setting a very, very small goals, like 10 words a day. Very often, I know that sounds crazy, but really it's not the words that are the problem, it's the showing up. And I find that when I show up and I allow myself just to write 10 words and then I can go play, that never happens. I never write just 10 words. You keep on going. And so really it's just setting small goals and then also longer term goals. And whether I'm inspired or not, at least showing up.
I think you hit it right there in the head. It is about showing up for me as well. And but something else that I think it can be easy for writers of all levels, maybe, and certainly for beginner writers to beat yourself up a little bit too much. I mean, it's okay to miss a day of writing every now and then, right? It's okay to. I mean, if you have deadlines, you got to do deadlines. I mean, you have to do your thing, and you got to. If you want to have a book published, you got to put in the work. It's work. It's not all magic and magical inspiration, right? But at the same time, it's all right to recognize that this isn't something you have to beat yourself up on, and you should be make an attempt. But if you got other stuff going on too, I've got a close friend who's got 2 little toddlers at home, and he's always so frustrated that he never has time to write. I'm like, dude, you have 2 little toddlers at home. It's okay. They'll grow up and it gets easier, And so you just have to find it for yourself through whatever little tricks, or, just work it out with a significant other or your family or work or whatever and go on a sabbatical or something.
Also things like National Novel Writing Month, like NaNoWriMo, that helped me a lot. I couldn't finish stories at all, but then I was like, okay, for 1 month out of the entire year, I'm going to prioritize this, and giving yourself permission to write Bradley. Like, I learned how to write consistently doing things like that. So just looking for external things to give you a deadline too can be really helpful before you get to that contract stage. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I'd say that writing is a muscle. Mm-hmm. It's something that you have to use, not every day, but and it's not like you have to keep writing the same novel each day. If you have like an idea or like an opinion, then sometimes it's nice to sit back and think like, how would I write this? How would I put this on the page? How would I put words together to capture what I'm feeling right now? So it doesn't necessarily have to be the piece of fiction that you're writing, but I do think it's helpful for every day to try and put together, either on the page or just in your mind, to try and make an effort to articulate an opinion, a position, a feeling, or just something. Because that's there's a friend of mine who works out quite a bit, and one day I was like, how do you do 20 pull-ups a day? And I was like, well, I didn't start off doing 20 pull-ups a day. I did 1, and then I almost died. So you have to build up slowly, but then at some point in time it becomes very easy, and then you learn how to do more and more things, and you can challenge yourself more and more.
I think it's important to learn how to write even when you're not feeling inspired, or to learn mind hacks to trick your brain into feeling inspired, and just 3 hacks that have worked pretty well for me. The first is, even if I'm feeling lazy on a day, I tell myself, just write 200 words. 200 words, that's 3 sentences. That's nothing. And by the time I get to 3 sentences, I usually want to write more. So it's a hack to just get started. The second is, if you're feeling stuck in the middle of a scene, just listen to music, direct a music video in your head, and let it go wherever you want, and then write that scene down. And the third is, when you finish writing for the day, end in the middle of a scene so that you're excited to go back the next day and you know exactly what you want to write. So that might help you.
Thank you for your question. With that, this concludes the panel. Thank you so much for being a great audience. Please give it up for our speakers.
Fictitious is hosted and produced by me, Adron Buske, and co-produced by Wendy Buske. If you've got a few minutes to spare and you'd like to help out the show, here are a couple of ways to spread the word about Fictitious. 1, you can leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. And 2, you can share a link to the show on Twitter, Facebook, or wherever you do the social networking thing. I can't stress enough how much these simple actions help to spread the word about the show, which helps us grow and bring you more awesome author guests, and it also helps those writers reach new audiences. You can follow Fictitious on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, all under the handle FictitiousPod, and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Google Play. And you can find all our episodes, plus book reviews, at fictitiouspodcast.com. Thanks for listening. More author conversations coming your way next week.